We'll be using the Grubb's test as a statistical test to remove outlier data from our data collected in lab. Imagine you're in lab and you take 4 measurements. 3 of them look very close together. The 4th one seems to be far away measurement from the other ones. Looks to be an outlier. There are 2 ways that you can eliminate this outlier data point from your data set. The first way is for you to check your experimental notes and observations and see if there was an error in your procedure. If so, you can discard the outlier. What I mean by an error in your procedure is perhaps you spilled some of the solid that you weighed onto the bench and had to sweep it back onto your weighing paper. Or maybe when you were transferring it into a volumetric flask, some spilled on the floor. Or perhaps when you were filling up a graduated cylinder, you didn't fill it up quite to the line. And you took note of that in your lab notebook, and so you realize that there's a problem with that data point and you can eliminate it from your data set. If no recorded error exists, however, you can perform a Grubb's test to determine if the outlier can be discarded statistically. In order to determine if your outlier data point is indeed an outlier statistically, you need to first calculate an experimental g-value using this equation that's on the right. Once you've calculated your experimental g-value, you're going to compare that to a table value from a table that we would give to you. If your experimental value is greater than the value in the table, then the outlier can be discarded. That means that those two, the data point and your average, are different statistically. Then you can discard your outlier. If the experimental value is less than the table value, then the outlier cannot be discarded. Statistically, they are the same, part of the same data set. So if you look at this equation, in order to calculate your experimental value, you take the absolute value of the difference between the questionable value and the average value. The questionable value needs to be the furthest point away from your average. So it needs to be either the highest point in your data set or the lowest point in your data set. The average value is the average for all points that were collected. At this point, you cannot say that that outlier can be discarded. So all 4 of those data points need to be included in the average. The standard deviation is also the standard deviation of all 4 data points in this case. So, for example, if you had these 4 measurements that you collected that are represented by these dots on this number line, you take an average and a standard deviation, and you execute the g-experiment equation. You take the average, or the absolute value of the difference between the outlier value, which is the lowest value in this case, and the average value. Divide that by the standard deviation, and you get your g-experiment. We need to compare that to the table value. The table of g-values that we would give you are based on 95% confidence interval, and you need to find the g-table value according to the number of measurements that you've collected. So for 4 measurements, we're comparing our experimental value to 1.463. In this case, our experimental value is less than the table value, so we need to keep that data point. It is not an outlier. If you would like to eliminate it, then the only other choice is to collect more data. So for example, if you were to collect a 5th point and it happened to fall in that grouping, then you could calculate a new average and a new standard deviation, recalculate g-experiment, and now compare that to the g-table for 5 measurements. In this case, my experimental value is greater than my table value, and therefore I can discard this point, this outlier point. So once I've discarded that point, then I can take a new average and a standard deviation. And this is what you would report in your lab report. Be careful that when you do eliminate outliers, that in your notebook or in your digital notebook, you are very careful to show this process. All data points need to be present in your notebook, and your G calculated in comparison to G table needs to be very clear.